Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our program. Jeff Pearce is a journalist, historian, and prolific writer with unusual and compelling stories. He has written a number of books and articles on Ethiopia, including Prevail, the inspiring story of Ethiopia's victory over Mussolini's invasion. He's my guest today in this edition of Artist Dialogue, and to stay with us. Jeff, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
You have written books and articles on Ethiopia, including Prevail, the inspiring story of Ethiopia's victory over Mussolini's invasion. What's so special about Ethiopia, and why are you so interested in the country?
Okay. The thing about the story that attracted me was it literally lends itself. There's never been a story like this I've come across that so neatly fits into drama. If you wrote this as a novel, nobody would believe it. You have a sovereign African nation, which is independent. You have fascists invade it, brazenly invade it, and the Western world says, well, that's very sad. Well, too bad we can't help you, even though they're supposed to be your allies. And so the nation faces things alone. Now, the thing is, in a normal three-act structure of drama, you have a situation, then you have things get worse. And of course, as we know, things got a lot worse for Ethiopia. They stood alone. The Italians invaded. You have massacres. You have looting of relics. You have mass crimes done against the populace. You have half the country occupied. In the Addis Ababa massacre alone of the Graziani massacre, you have a conservative estimate of 20,000 people slaughtered. That doesn't even take into account the number that are killed in the Debre Labanos massacre and so forth. Now, the thing is, if you compare that to the rest of the colonialist history of Africa, that should be where the story ends. And yet, out of all that comes a people who say, no, we're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep going on. And all of the Western histories, with a couple of exceptions that I've read, are kind of ridiculous because they make the story stop at 36 and go, well, that's it. That's over. And they treat it as war. And my research found that no, there was a continuous resistance literally from the day that the Italians rolled into the capital. There were snipers up in the mountains over shooting down at the Italians. And so this insurgency of the patriots continued right up until liberation. And then you have this heroic saving of the nation, which is just an amazing story. You couldn't write this as a movie and have it believed. It's just, there are stories in there that you're looking at the individual cases of courage. And I've been privileged to have met Jagamakelo before he died and was telling me adventures while he lay in bed. There's a story of Lekalesh Bayan, the female patriot. You have all these wonderful heroes and characters. I mean, at one point, I was reading old files in the British archives, and I came across a story where the Italian soldiers were so demoralized that they were hiding down underneath a railway car so that when it drove into a station, they were hiding and the patriots were sniping at them with rifles. And so they radio back and the other soldiers don't want to go. The Italians don't want to go. So they send another train. They're like huddled, and they smash into the first train. And they got two trains of Italians, and it's like comedy. And you're looking at this going, this is for real. This is an actual British account of the story. You couldn't make these things up. And it's just amazing, the heroism and courage. And so you fall in love with the story. So people always ask me, how did you get interested? Why do you care so much about this? And I always say back to them, who do I have to be? Look at the story. Look at the narrative. Look how amazing this is. This should be taught in Western schools. This should be taught in schoolrooms in Europe. This should be taught in schoolrooms in the United States. 20,000 Black Americans marched in Harlem on August 3rd, 1935 for Ethiopia. This is before Martin Luther King. This is before Malcolm X. You had people walking around going, don't call me Black. Don't call me Negro. I'm Ethiopian. They said that. And do you know where the slogan, hands off Ethiopia, that is all over social media came from today?
Yeah.
It came from there. They had signs saying, hands off Ethiopia. So here we are, unfortunately, full circle, back to a time where we have to use that slogan again.
Yeah, indeed. Jeff, you also argue that it is essential that there be a greater understanding and appreciation of Ethiopian history, both by Ethiopians and the people overseas. Can you explain that to me?
I don't think the problem is that we're dealing with people who, we're dealing with journalists and to a certain degree, analysts who their whole approach is from the perspective of treating, it's a very colonial mindset that treats Ethiopians and to a certain extent Africans in general as people to be studied. There's no empathy there. There's no sympathy there. There's no appreciation of the history of Ethiopia. And my own personal, this is my own personal view in terms of researching the history. And I intend to write a new history of Ethiopia where I lay out the proof for this. But all of my research suggests that the different ethnic peoples of the country have worked collaboratively and cooperatively since time immemorial, far more than is depicted in the history. The common history that you get would pit Tigrayans against Amhara, Amhara against Oromo, and so forth, and this people against that people. Well, everything that I've read so far shows that they were far more collaborative, cooperative than is depicted. But look at the news coverage that we're seeing today. It portrays the conflict as if it's rooted in ethnic conflict rather than a political one. So you're starting with this colonial mindset that says, oh, well, the Africans want to kill each other. They've always wanted to kill each other. No one would analyze a European conflict this way, with the notable exception of the Balkans, where they use that same kind of rubric. But you have the same kind of condescension towards Eastern Europe that's comparable, but not quite similar to Africa. The only way we're going to get through this is to go back to the history. I've got a new book coming out next year on African ideas in terms of the intellectual legacy of Africa, which the world doesn't pay attention to. And the introduction ends with a line saying, you know, the Western world will wake up and it will start to understand and appreciate Africa when it stops thinking of Africa as children and starts treating it as its mother, as talking to its mother. And I should quote myself better, but that's essentially the thought. And you're seeing this kind of analysis, which again is this very colonial mindset of, look at what happened with the G7 meeting, where you have a snapshot of people and the caption says, they're discussing the Tigray situation. Is there one representative for Ethiopia in the room? No. Is there one African in the room? No. So there's a bunch of white Western North Americans, one Canadian, the Prime Minister, and a bunch of Europeans all sitting around talking about a part of Africa, and they're going to try and resolve your problems for you. Doesn't anybody have a problem with that? Should somebody be, saying, hey, it's looking very white in that room? So that's my 2 cents for it.
As you know, Ethiopia is grappling with misinformation and disinformation, especially by Western media outlets as we speak. We know also that TPLF cliques are unfailing, if you like, in their attempt to tarnish Ethiopia's image and do whatever it takes to achieve their schemes. And many say most of the stories by the Western media outlets are carbon copy of TPLF's framing of the issue. What's your take here?
It's ridiculous. We're seeing an open admission by CNN saying, well, yes, we got the video of these soldiers supposedly shooting guys and tossing them off a cliff from Tigray Media House. And you're looking at this going, really? This is your source, and this is how you treat material from a source that is clearly with a biased political agenda, and what's worse is a ethnic propaganda network. You have that. You have Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Crisis Group, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch in particular, who were saying, well, for the Axum massacre, yeah, we phoned up our witnesses long distance. We didn't verify who they are, and that's good enough. And as I pointed out in an article, funny how Debretsion Gebremichael says we took Axum, we captured Axum. He texts this to Reuters staff, news staff. Well, is he lying now or was he lying then? Which is it? How do you have a massacre when you claim that you captured the territory? You have Nima Elbiger, who in a report for CNN says, and I would have to check the precise quote, but it's in my article, where she says something to the effect of, these Tigrayan defenders, defenders pushed Eritrean soldiers out of this town a little while before. And we see footage of these guys moving away from the camera. And you look at this and you're going, okay, well, why aren't you talking to them on camera? How do we know this for sure? The first thing you do if you go into a war zone as a journalist is you'd want to speak to who's holding the territory, who's the officer that you talk to, but we don't. So how do we know? Why are we supposed to take this claim at face value? We know anecdotally that there are fixers who are working with the Western media who are compromised, who are TPLF operatives. We know this for a fact because this has happened to at least a couple of individuals where they've borne witness to this. And what's more, the thing is, if we go back to the Maikadra massacre, as Jamal Countess of Getty Images showed with his work, the witnesses they spoke to, they talked about the violence happening in Maikadra November 6th. Now, in the previous narratives of this, it was claimed that the violence started on November 9th. His witnesses say November 6th. Nobody seems to pay attention to the fact that this is 2 days after, or 3 days after, you want to call it November 3rd evening, the attacks on the military outposts. That can't be coincidence. Yet there is clearly a concentrated, deliberate campaign to obfuscate the facts and make us look away. Nothing to see here. Let's not pay attention to the fact that this was clearly planned from the start. Someone just the other day pointed out on social media that Tigray genocide was used as a hashtag November 4th. How do you have a genocide on the very day that the belligerents are fighting? How do you have a genocide all of a sudden the very day? The military outposts were attacked that very evening, the previous evening, but suddenly there's a genocide while you've slaughtered a whole bunch of soldiers in their beds. But we're supposed to believe there's a Tigray genocide that's already started. I'd really like to know. I'd really like to know, why is it that for the Axum massacre, the body count keeps going down and the shills for the Tigray genocide, the TPLF trolls, in terms of all the groups, Amnesty International, HRW, Crisis Group, keep saying, oh, well, there's still evidence of a massacre. Well, yes, it's true that there is a count that you could be defined as a massacre. But 40 dead is a hell of a lot different from 750 first reported dead. And let me add a proviso here just before I finish your question. No one should be claiming, and I don't think the Ethiopian government is either, or the Ethiopian military. No one is claiming that there has not been atrocities and excesses on both sides. This is a war. The tragedy of this situation is we are not going to get at the truth easily. It could be years before we be able to parse out what actually happened, because you have a whole bunch of idiots who are going out of their way to cry atrocity on every single thing. Look at what we've had so far. We've had claims of Russian mercenaries. We've had claims of white phosphorus. We've had claims of, you know, Dennis Wadley saying, oh, there's a ship in the Black Sea that's bringing in weapons. Does anybody believe that the Ethiopian government would waste precious days on a ship going all the way through the Black Sea to get to a landlocked country to bring in weapons? Great, we're getting more arms. Slowly, the ship will bring you your munitions. Really? We're supposed to take this seriously? It's ridiculous. It's almost as if they're daring us to see how far the credulity will be bent where we're supposed to believe these ridiculous claims. They're recycling photos of Vietnam era planes firing white phosphorus missiles from the 1960s and early 70s. And they pair those with messages claiming that a new white phosphorus attack has happened with 1960s footage, with 1960s photographs, for instance. What are we supposed to do with that?
Many agree that this has led the US to impose sanctions on Ethiopia without first-hand information and without observing the realities on the ground. What do you make out of this?
I think that it's doomed to fail. It will hurt the country, but of course it will hurt the wrong people. I taught journalism for a very brief window of time in Myanmar. Myanmar had at that time, and I cannot pretend that I know automatically the situation where it is with that now in terms of economic punitive measures. But at the time that I was there in 2005, it was still under sanctions. Now, the thing is, the infrastructure was such that you had buildings covered in huge swaths of mold because it's a tropical country. You had potholed roads. The country had widespread poverty and so forth. But you know something? All that happened was the military junta there said, okay, well, who else will partner with us? And they turned to China and they turned to India, which didn't really care in terms of the internal situation. They said, yep, we'll invest in you. And off they went. So of course the country hurt, but it didn't slow the regime down in terms of its business as usual at all. Hardly a dent. It went on for years. Look at the example of South Africa during the apartheid regime. Yes, you could make a case that sanctions hurt, but where did South Africa get its weapons from? Israel, a stalwart ally of the United States, who was quite willing to ignore what its senior partner in real politics wanted and said, yeah, we'll sell you these guys who treat black people like second-class and third-class citizens. We'll give them weapons. They didn't think twice about it. And that went on for years too. So ultimately, sanctions are not really, I don't think they really work. Even if we go back to the example of what I wrote about in Prevail. Sanctions were used against Italy and Ethiopia in that, and who did it hurt? It hurt Ethiopia. Meanwhile, the Italians had already imported the weapons that they wanted, and their sanctions didn't include oil. So Italy went, okay, invasion on schedule. Yeah, I don't think sanctions ever really are super effective. They would have to be used in concert. But the ultimate real point is, who are you trying to hurt? You're going to hurt the very people that you claim that you want to help. And there are people, Tigray is already, the region is already suffering from locusts, is already suffering from food insecurity, not because of this war, but because Tigray normally, as I understand it, has agricultural deficits in terms of how much it can yield in terms of crops. Why is nobody bothering to talk to an actual agricultural engineer to find out that simple fact in terms of how the land actually produces year after year? It has nothing to do with the war. So as I understand it, there was widespread food insecurity in Tigray even before this whole mess started, and there was aid going there. Yet that's conveniently forgotten in Western reportage. Why? I'd really like to know why. I'd really like someone to explain that to me on the editorial boards of these major media labels. So.
Yeah. So can we relate that to the statement the Chinese made on the recent G7 meeting, which says the era of few countries ruling the world is long gone?
It is long gone. But that is a very self-serving statement. And the thing is, I should be clear. I have no great love. I put this in print and I'll stand by it. I have no great love for the Putin regime. I have no great love for an autocrat who arranges for his political rivals to be assassinated right on a bridge overlooking the Kremlin. I have no love for Putin. I have even less for the Beijing regime in terms of how its human rights record, of which I have more than a passing familiarity. But that's not the problem here. That's not the issue here. The issue is if the West is going to play this game of complete hypocrisy and try to lecture a sovereign nation on how it does its internal affairs, when meanwhile there's an epidemic of black men in the United States getting killed by police officers, when you have widespread food insecurity in the United States, and they're going to lecture Ethiopia about how it handles taking care of its own. Don't give me this crap. Ethiopia is entitled to make friends with who it likes. And if it wants to deal with other countries which are happy to invest in it, that's the choice of its government and its people. Why is it, as I wrote, you have a tremendous financial relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia, a country which assassinated a prominent Arabic American journalist in a consulate of Turkey. And the Turks were more upset by this than the Americans. Trump didn't do a thing. Biden won't do a thing. This is how they treat, this is how they treat the situation in terms of one of their own. You were actually better off, as I just wrote in my last piece, you were actually better off in some ways being one of America's enemies than you are being one of its friends. You know, we don't see North Korea being spoken to this way. We don't see Turkey being spoken to this way. We don't see Saudi Arabia being spoken to this way. Why is it that all this bellicose bullying is reserved for African nations? I'd really like to know.
What's your message to Ethiopians and friends of Ethiopia as part of the efforts to, curb or to tackle such challenges posed against Ethiopia from all sides?
The problem is that so far we have been playing the troll game. I don't think people understand or fully appreciate. It hasn't come home that the second front of this war is a digital war. And perhaps we're seeing this for the first time. Whatever the situation is, and I'm not on the ground, I can't assess it, but whatever the situation is in terms of bringing the TPLF finally to heel, because they've lost major figures. You've got those young soldiers who are trying to cross the border. who were apparently, I think, connected to my cadre, if I remember correctly. And they were brought in. They're basically child soldiers. You have that one front. And then on this second front, you have the digital war. And we haven't seen anything like this, I don't think, where think about the ramifications of what's been happening. Your army pretty much hammered the TPLF in 3 weeks. These battle-hardened troops, boom, done, dusted, almost done. Maybe it evolves into an insurgency, and the entire Western media says, well, it'll be an insurgency. But that was a humiliating blow to them. So what do we get? Instantly, they turn the spin cycle, and it becomes they're playing victimhood and allying themselves with innocent Tigrayans who are caught in the middle of all this, who deserve everyone's sympathy right across Ethiopia and also the world, but not for the reasons that people think, because they're casting them as supporting the TPLF as a majority, when in fact you have a population that's intimidated by a terrorist organization. And so we've never seen anything like this, where a whole digital army can completely gaslight the world and say, they're starving and they're suffering atrocities and they're suffering mass rapes and there's white phosphorus and there's Russian mercenaries and there's this and this and this. Every damn day we are dealing with brush fires of disinformation where it's a ridiculous degree, and we're playing their game so far. We're being reactive. We're not being proactive in terms of saying, let's change the conversation. Why aren't you talking about this? Why aren't you talking about the fact that the old international laws forbid the use of child soldiers? Why aren't you talking about the fact of while you were busy screaming famine, famine, which has not been confirmed at all, you have video coming out of TPLF soldiers dancing up and down and singing along. Well, they don't look starving. And what's more, why are they helping the people who supposedly are starving? Why aren't you attending to them? Why isn't anybody talking about what I uncovered with help, the fact that UN officials are actively interfering with the return of schools, with school exams? Why are we talking about the fact that these UN officials and UN staff have been caught trying to sneak TPLF soldiers back into Addis Ababa? Why aren't we talking about the fact that on one occasion where it made headlines, where UN vehicle crossed through border checks, blew past, and then confronted one of the ministers of your government and said, we had authorization. And she very correctly said, show me. And they went, well, we've got it here somewhere. Let's look. Let's see. And finally, they had to admit, no, they don't have it. And they had to apologize in public. And nobody wants to talk about that. Yet at the same time, they're talking about unfettered access. It's already proven that they can't respect the basic rules that they agree to. Moreover, why aren't we talking about the fact that you don't need to be there? If the planes bring in aid, please tell me why these people have to be there to have access to the area. You have plenty of Ethiopians who would be glad to work unloading skiffs of aid and sacks of grain and flour and medical packages. Why do you need them there? You have staff, you have people. So my message is the plane lands at Mekelle or Shira or whatever. The aid gets lowered onto the tarmac. Bye. Thanks. We'll take it from here. Your services are not required past that point. Why aren't we changing the conversation to that? Aside from medical doctors and nurses, I cannot think, or specialists in terms of other disciplines, I can't think of any reason why you need access to those areas. And even if you do, they should be escorted by Ethiopian staff. Tell me one country who, if it was in a similar crisis, would say, well, of course, we'll let you through our security. What country in the world will allow that? And yet they seem to expect that Ethiopia should roll over and give that access to them. No other country in the world would grant that kind of permission, ever.
Yeah, of course. All right. Let's also talk about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which Ethiopia is building on the Abai River or on the Nile River. Now, Egypt and the Sudan are, as you know, crying foul, citing significant harm. And this time around, they're even trying to dictate Ethiopia on how to fill the dam on this rainy season, coming rainy season, or in July. Why do you think they keep so consistent in this endeavor while distancing themselves from tripartite negotiation?
Because this is the game. I find it very interesting that here's, again, this is what I find so funny, because nobody reads or nobody bothers to open a damn book. This is a country that under Nasser closed the Suez Canal and tore up its deal with Britain and France and said, screw you, your deal was unfair. We want a better one, and closed the canal. And to be fair, the British and French went behind everybody's back and colluded with Israel to start a war. And they got caught. And so you can't blame the Egyptians for standing up for themselves in that respect. But please don't turn around decades and decades later and say, well, let's go back to this colonial agreement of which your country wasn't even a part of and wave that in people's faces and say, here's this thing from 1906? Is that one or the other date? It's in the 1900s. Memory fails me on this respect. Well, it's just hilarious to say, let's wave a colonial agreement and you're the nation of Nasser. And it's just so funny. What's more, these objections are kind of absurd because if you actually look at the information objectively, this in the long run is going to benefit the entire region. It's a dam. It's going to benefit everybody in the long run. And I don't recall anyone, well, I wasn't cognizant, I was alive, but I wasn't cognizant at the time. But I don't remember anyone, part of my language, bitching and complaining over the construction of the Aswan Dam. Let's remember that with the Aswan Dam, which people forget, is you're familiar with Abu Simbel, the Sudan wonderful national treasures. I was seeing if I could find the book. I mean, the entire thing was lifted and moved, something which I only recently discovered, to make way for the dam. It's not in the place it used to be. They had to move it. And still you don't have complaints over that. And they moved it because they knew that once the construction of the dam was completed, it would have been flooded. There's huge sections of Sudan's archaeological and historical heritage underwater that you know, the experts will never get to because Egypt needed its way in terms of building its dam. So don't come to Ethiopia and try to lecture it on where it wants to put its infrastructure. You know, they treat the Nile. This is the Egyptian government. I am not going to conflate the Egyptian people with the Egyptian government. I'm sure ordinary Egyptian people are quite reasonable. But don't come and try to lecture Ethiopia on the use of on how it makes its infrastructure when you've done stunts like that. Moreover, you have aquifers and other water resources which you haven't even fully taken advantage of. And you keep saying, well, the Nile is our life. Yeah, but have you considered these other resources, and have you considered how it's going to benefit the entire region? This is going to be remarkable when it finally the filling is all done and completed. I mean, what a day, what a dawn it's going to be in terms of a boon to Ethiopia in terms of hydroelectric power, in terms of the secondhand benefits, in terms of development. It's going to be amazing. It's going to be amazing. I'm looking forward to seeing how the country opens up to that when that finally happens.
I really wish we had more time. And I really enjoyed your perspectives, obviously. And thank you so much for being with us. And I hope we will see each other sometime in the future.
Thank you.
Well, dear viewers, that was Jeff Pearce talking to us in this edition of this dialogue. Many thanks for your company so far. Until I see you with another program next time, it's goodbye from me, Shifarao Lagao.